Shukran, Muriel. I'm sure there will be time for shedding more light on the question here through the discussion and the Q&A. This is about Europe, and so that we don't say the Italians are to be blamed, we should hold ourselves accountable. Our generation was raised up to call Arab regimes as a bad word, to use the word Arab regimes as a bad word. And then we were hoping for new regimes, and then we failed we tried our own regime, but we failed in all aspects, and we imported from the Arab regimes the worst of the laws and the systems. And we reached a state of a political stalemate, an impasse, and also social slacking. Do we have options? Yes, but are we ready to pay the cost of these options? Are we ready to leave our comfortable positions and pay the price that is needed? We'll leave it now to Dr. Ezbidi, who is a professor at the master's program here in Birzeit University and a different faculty member also. And so his question, are Palestinian political elites part of the impasse of the Palestinian National Liberation Project? The answer is yes. I can give you the answer now, but Dr. Ezbidi will tell us why they are part of this impasse. Thank you. I summarized my paper actually, or answered it right away there and then. Allow me to read, I will have to read from my paper so that I'm able to say everything I wanted to cover in the time allocated to me. One intervention, one presentation as this one will not be capable of covering all aspects of the discussion and the controversy regarding the impasse or the several impasses of the Palestinian National Liberation Project. This paper will focus on a specific aspect that is reflected by the following question: are the Palestinian elites part of the impasse of the Palestinian National Liberation Project? This important question entails a hypothesis that there is an impasse that the Palestinian Liberation Project is undergoing, and this impasse that does not allow national salvation in terms of independence and freedom, and that there are specific reasons for this impasse. Some has to do with the negative role of the Palestinian elites, whether by what they did in terms of their actions or or lack of action of these elites. There are several questions that we can be raised here, whether or not the national project is in a case of impasse. This is something very evident and is preoccupying the minds of many, but it is how to approach elites and in understanding a complex situation such as the Palestinian situation. And this is something that I would like to clarify further before talking about the relationship of the elites with this impasse. The methodology of analyzing the elites. This methodology starts with a hypothesis that all governance regimes, political regimes, whether democratic or authoritarian, are elites that control directly or indirectly and influence the type of decisions and uses the financial and moral resources to achieve their interests. These interests that do not necessarily all the time correspond with the interests of the public. Such as other forms of analysis, such as democratic, Marxist, legal, institutional, or developmental methodologies of analysis, we can understand the methodology of analyzing the elites as an instrumental tool to understand the political context and the mechanisms of its operations and to explain its actions and outcomes. This methodology looks at the political elites as groups that work together to coordinate efforts among the different actors within the society to devise policies and address the challenges. And since these groups govern or seek to govern, they try to activate the political life, maintain community balance, spreading values and ethics that are collective to the political group that they want to control. Some of these groups start to frame the citizens and try to and the others try to mitigate the authoritarian type or nature of the regimes, and therefore some people see that these political elites are a lever that is needed to maintain social balance and stability and achieving political, economic and social development. There are three perspectives that, or entry points to look at the elites. Some look at them as a group or that rules or seeks to rule, and the criteria here is the power. And the second looks at them as a values and or a range of values that makes a group of people qualified to rule others, whereby the criteria here is ethical. The other point of view looks at the elites based on their function within the society, since the criteria here is functional. For purposes of this presentation, I do not define political elites as a group of people that is coherent and homogeneous or unified, or as a group where the members have value or ethical or political privileges, but rather as groups that are as multiple as the people and the members of the community and the different interests of its individuals and the discrepancies among their ideologies and political thinking, and that they have the resources that can control or influence the system of power and can do many main functions that affect the state and the society. This definition says also that the elites are different from each other in terms of their interests and level of influence and in influencing decision-making processes and translating them into public policies. And according to this definition, I tried to answer the main question of this presentation: are the Palestinian elites part of the impasse of the Palestinian liberation project? Undoubtedly, the Palestinian case is a good example or a good case study for monitoring and analyzing the role of elites, since this is a state where there is no sovereignty of a state, and the whole political space or arena is controlled by the elites, whether these are political, economic, social or cultural elites. These elites, since the Nakba, had played an important role in the national action and activism that in the 60s led to the emergence of the Palestinian resistance movement that established the PLO, that mobilized Palestinians and took their question to the international arena and international community, so that it becomes a political question after being for long a question of refugees who are fragmented and dispersed and are the custody of different countries. The absence of the sovereign state had increased the importance of these elites and made them more influential in framing the political system, and they had the resources and took decisions regarding the Palestinian liberation project and the details of the lives of Palestinians wherever they are. This does not mean that these elites were free, but for long they have been subject to many restrictions and parameters that were imposed by the powers of others, especially, for example, the state, the occupation, and also to a certain extent the regimes in Arab countries, or even both Israel and Arab countries. Regardless of our opinion about these elites and what decisions they took, it is important to analyze their journeys in terms of their ideologies, values, tendencies, and circumstances for their establishment, their activities, their roles, and its relations internally and externally, and the implications of all that on their role in terms of the failure of the national project. In referring to the definition of elites that I used earlier, we can say that the political elite in Palestine today, and here I want to speak in a practical sense, this elite includes the president of the PA, the prime minister, the heads or the leaders of factions and political parties and members of their political bureaus, the ministers of the Ramallah government, those who control Gaza Strip, heads of security agencies and armed agencies, and also members of the national and legislative councils, editors-in-chief of newspapers, advisors of the president, the reform, traditional tribal reform activists, imams at mosques, some leaders of civil society organizations, some intellectuals and community leaders, businessmen, private sector, including those who are dealing economically with Israel. These elites, we see that they are not coherent or homogeneous. We see the political, the institutional, some who are secular, some religious, some are independent, some are part of parties, others are not, and the elements of these elites are not based on specific social factors due to the absence of class divisions within the Palestinian society to a large extent, and also the absence of sectarianism and ethnic discrimination or minorities, and as a result these elites use force instead of dialogue, compromise and partnership, and they improvise instead of going to institutional planning. And the absence of national references that control the work led the conflict among these elites that led to the detriment of the Palestinian society, as is the case with the current internal division. And the conflict was heightened by the obsession of these elites of power and control, and because this will give them gains and privileges, despite the fact that the elected institutions, their legitimacy had elapsed after the end of their legitimate terms. And this they are also subject to ideological influences and political and external financial influences made them parasitic to a large extent, so that they are living off external support or illegitimate internal sources of financing that created space for a lot of corruption in the absence of laws and the absence of transparency and accountability. Briefly, the political elites are elites that have been separated from its liberation origins and roots, and became involved in fighting over the management of a power that is paralyzed, that has not the minimum qualifications for a continued existence. These elites, regardless of their ideology and the nature of their composition and to what extent they are legitimate, had caused whether aware or without their awareness, whether out of good intention or bad intention, had led to the failure of the Palestinian liberation project after long decades of struggle and sacrifice. And this is reflected in the situation that Palestine lives today compared to the major successes that the Zionist project is achieving in view of the regional and international changes today. The question is, are the Palestinian elites part of the impasse of the Palestinian Liberation Project? The answer is not only yes, but they are not only part of the impasse, but rather they created the impasse to start with, and liberation and emancipation will not be achieved under the continued existence of these elites and their control of what they call the National Liberation Project. And for that claim, I give you the following justifications and rationale. The lack of consistent objectives. The story of the Palestinian state summarizes the failure of the liberation project, and whereby the political elites abandoned the one democratic state on the full Palestinian soil for a Palestinian state on a 1967 borders, and this was also abandoned practically for a state without Jerusalem and that has settlement blocks and that is demilitarized and maybe can accept to be under the control of the NATO. And this was justified sometimes under realpolitik or pragmatism, and sometimes by the visionary and ingenious nature of the political elites, that the leaders of whom think that they can see what others cannot. Therefore, there is no clarity today about the objectives of the liberation project, whether it's state or rights, and how to achieve that. And they share the failure in identifying these questions or answering these questions, whether from the ruling elites or the elites in the opposition. lack of close links between the objectives and the instruments. There was a unilateral control by the elites over the instruments for realizing the national rights. There was the armed resistance in the beginning that was not an option for a long period of time, and it was replaced by negotiations without achieving any positive impact in both cases. Today, the part of the conflict is about Fatah accepting or endorsing negotiations without resistance, where Hamas accepts resistance without negotiations. Therefore, the vagueness of the objectives means that the instruments are used in a chaotic manner that is detrimental to both options, and also the changing of the instruments shows that there is a lack of vision and political vision. Instruments have no value without their function and serving the purposes for which they are used. And the feasibility of these instruments is defined by the answers to the following questions: who resists, who negotiates, why, how, and when. Third, putting the private interest over the public interest. The elites have historically put their factional visions at the account of the national collective vision, and this led to armed conflicts, internal conflicts, as happened in Jordan, Lebanon, and Gaza, and led to deepening the discrepancies, whether ideological or political or even personal, among the Palestinian factions. And the factions had weakened the Palestinian political system as a whole, in the PLO, in the PA, in the society, and we see where power sharing and also a lot of corruption as a result of that. The large extent of the weakness of the PA and its fragility today is as a result of the exhaustion of this authority after being controlled for so long by one faction, Fatah in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza, and where the two parties have turned their back to everything else in terms of what is collective and national objectives. Putting personalizing things over working as an institution, and for a long time the political elites ran the national affairs as a personalized matter, and we see where personalizing all the work has affected it came at the detriment of the institutional work. Otherwise, how do we understand such terms as like Al-Hakim, the wise man, the spiritual father, or a leader with the size of a homeland, and all these kinds of terms that come close to some kind of sacred, holy person that make their people, the people who are given these titles, people above any kind of accountability. Also weak belonging or affiliation or membership of political factions. Belonging to political factions in Palestine in general was not as out of national interest, but neither in the past nor today, but rather for private gains. And this led to static hierarchy within the movements and the political parties, between the elites or the aristocracy of these political parties in the leadership entities, and between the rest of their members. Despite the fact that the political parties and movements take from their popular constituencies and bases a base for the mobilization and support, yet they don't give these members any important roles within their movements, and this leads to a kind of procrastination within these parties, and leads to lack of accountability and review and assessment, as well as there is a failure to develop culture and national identity, because these parties are not working on promoting these identity and the cultural national culture because they put their own interests over the public national interest. The absence of democracy. Democracy is not only elections, it is much deeper than that. But even if we accepted that democracy is only reflected in elections, we can see we see that it is almost completely absent from the lives of Palestinians. In 1996 elections, the elections were not conducted to reflect the intentions and the will of the Palestinian people, but rather to legitimize the Oslo Agreement and to produce a Palestinian partner that is able to implement any agreement. The same was repeated in the presidential and legislative elections in 2005 and 2006, which came to mark the end of the Arafat era and the beginning of a new era that is more rational and less inclined to violence and extremism and more open to Israel. And these presidential elections laid the foundation for almost an absolute power that managed the country through decrees and took control over the financial and symbolic resources and has become very powerful over everybody else. And this is not legitimate. The legitimacy of the president has elapsed for years now, whereas the legislative elections came also to reveal the fragility of the Palestinian democracy, because people did not recognize the results of the elections internally, regionally, or internationally. And it means now that the continued control of the current elites is not defined by their legitimacy or what achievements they make, but rather the satisfaction or non-objection of Israel and the regional and international actors to what these elites are doing in terms of functions and tasks. 7. This association of the elites between the elites and the people on the one hand, but also among the elites themselves that are fighting for control over power, and what programs and resistance initiatives are requested on the other. And here we see the deepening of the division and the state of loss that the elites are undergoing in terms of their factions and parties and civil society organizations, and this is reflected catastrophically in terms of managing the conflict with Israel. On top of this disassociation and detachment, there is also the siege, unemployment, poverty and fragmentation, but this does not affect the elite, and they continue to promote whatever they do as a victory. The marginalized role of the civil society organizations. The situation of civil society organizations is not much different from that of the PLO, the PA, and the parties, because it has also internalized many of the authoritarian and favoritism practices, as well as lack of transparency and corruption, and they are also a reflection of what the donors want, and they have become also spaces for corruption, and they are not less dangerous than the political elites. Both of them are outside the control of the government or the society or the donor countries. To conclude, maybe it's very important to remind that one of the reasons for establishing the PLO in 1964 was to unify the Palestinians, and this has been achieved after the PLO became a very important entity for every Palestinian and was able to represent them. But today the situation reminds us of the situation of loss that Palestinians felt in the beginning of the 60s. Palestinians are fragmented and are internal dispute inside the Palestine and outside of it, and therefore the question, do they need a new movement as they had in the beginning of the 60s? Can this resurrection happen through elites that have failed to achieve the minimum of what was supposed to be achieved? Hasn't the time come for these elites to be referred to retirement? And if they don't do that voluntarily, and they will not, is there a way to force them to retire and leave the place to others? And this is a question that all Palestinians need to think of and answer.